Okay, we're in the book of Micah today. Just as a brief review, what is a minor prophet as opposed to a major prophet? What's the big difference?
It's a smaller number of scriptures. It's not a large book. So
it's the size of the book. The size of the book. It's not the importance of the prophet. It's not that at all. It is the size of the book. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, those are long, big books, many chapters. These are short books. Some of them are just 1, 2, 3 chapters. I think this one today is 7 chapters. You can easily sit down and read one of these at one sitting. It takes a little longer, maybe a little deeper study to understand a short book like that, but that's part of the reason why we're studying the minor prophets today. The task of a prophet was to speak for God. They were chosen by God. They were led by the Spirit. They were told the word of God, and then they were told to go tell that word to his people. And mostly they were words of judgment, because at the time of the minor prophets, this was after Solomon had lost the kingdom and the northern kingdom had split away from the southern kingdom. You had the kingdom in the north. The capital of that was Samaria. The southern tribes called Judah. The capital of that was Jerusalem. So you had Samaria in the north, you had Jerusalem in the south. And although Judah was somewhat more faithful than Israel was, they were also unfaithful too. So we have minor prophets. Some were from the north, some were from the south. Micah was from the south, but he prophesied to the north. So whatever the calling was, these men responded to the call that God had for them. We'll find out in almost every book that we'll study in the minor prophets, it starts off with judgment and it ends up with hope. So there's always, hope always follows judgment. We'll see that today in Micah. We'll see it in all of the books of the minor prophets that we study. As I mentioned, this was a time when the northern kingdoms had split apart from the southern kingdoms. We'll find out that today the kings that are mentioned in the first chapter of Micah are, let me look real quick here. It's Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. Now we can date those kings. And we know that it happened between 748 BC and 687 BC. So we know that Micah lived and prophesied during this time. But he may not have started when Jotham started. He may not have ended when Hezekiah ended. His prophecy could have been in the middle of those three reigns. So it could have been as short as 20 years that he prophesied. But if you look at the whole 3 reigns of the kings, it could have been as much as 50 years. It doesn't tell us. We don't really know, and I'm not even sure how important that really is. But we do know that he was alive and lived and prophesied when the northern kingdom was taken away. Does somebody have that date? 721, 722 BC was when the northern kingdom was attacked by who? Assyria, and taken off into captivity. So Micah prophesies about this, but it also comes to pass, and he's alive when this happens. So we know that this is the time period that Micah prophesied. I mentioned that Micah was from Judah, but he was called or compelled to prophesy to the northern kingdoms. He also had some prophecy for the southern kingdoms too, because they were were disobedient and rebellious to God as well. And some of those prophecies came about after Micah's time, and those prophecies alluded to Judah being taken off into captivity. And who did that? Babylon. And that wasn't until I had the date of 586, 580, is that right? 586 BC? I didn't bring that part with me. Anyway, that was, if you look at the difference between 721 and 586, I think was the number, it's about 134, 135 years. So 130 something years go by before Judah is also taken away into that captivity. I'm a little confused about how all of this history works with Israel and Judah, but it seems to me like what I have understood about it and what I've read about it is when the northern tribes were taken away, they really never completely came back. They kind of just assimilated into the population of the north, of Samaria. Hence the Samaritans. Now, is that right, or do I have that right in my mind? Jim, Greg?
There were some that came down into the southern kingdom, and of the various tribes.
Okay.
Because when you get to the New Testament, you still have the tribe of Simeon represented by Anna. Is that right?
So did the northern tribes actually keep their identity as tribes, do you think?
Well,
somewhat, maybe?
Somewhat. I mean, she says she was of the tribe of Simeon.
Okay. So they kind of held on to that heritage, even though they never really completely came back from that
Right.
Assyrian captivity. Judah's the one that did come back from Babylonian captivity, rebuilt Jerusalem, rebuilt the temple, and so much of what we read about the remnant of Israel and the remnant of Judah, that more applies, I think, to the southern kingdom. Am I right in assuming that? I'm getting a nod. There's a lot of history here, and I've always heard about all of this, but unless you study it closely, it's really hard to understand all of the details about the northern kingdoms, the southern kingdoms, and the like. But this is the time period that the minor prophets are alive and prophesying. So Micah is alive during the time that Assyria comes in and takes away, captures the capital city of Samaria and takes away Israel into captivity. Prophesied by other prophets as well, but that's the time period what Micah prophesied about. We know practically nothing about Micah as a person. Other minor prophets tells us that they were farmers and shepherds and where they lived and what they did for a living and some things about their lives. Micah's not that way. The only reference we have is in Micah 3, I think verse 8, where it talks about Yeah, 3 verse 8. But as for me, I am filled with power, with the Spirit of the Lord, and with justice and might to declare to Jacob his transgression, to Israel his sin. So Micah is a man that's full of the Spirit, called to prophesy, mostly called to prophesy to the north. But other than that, we don't know a whole lot about him, about what he did for a living, whether or not he was a priest or a layman, whether or not he was a farmer or a shepherd, or if he had some other trade. We just don't know that about him. Okay, that's kind of a review and an intro to the book. Let's start looking at some of major points and the major prophecies. And I'm going to jump around a little bit. I'm not just going to start with the first chapter. I'm just going to start with the major things that Micah prophesied against. In the little book that we've got by Jack Lewis, he divided it down into 4 categories, but there's some subcategories in the 4 categories. In chapter 7, verse 2, Micah talks about the disappearance of the righteous man. He could not find a righteous man. Nobody was doing right. There may have been a few, but they were few and far between. There are other prophets that allude to this sort of thing, the breakdown of Israel, the breakdown of the people of God. They just got so far away from God that they loved evil and hated good. They looked for ways to get into mischief. They looked for ways to get into evil. And that is so far removed from what they were at one time when they did follow God and obey his commands. The other thing that they were doing was they were somewhat holding on to the worship of God, but they were mixing in the worship of idols. God abhors that over and over again. This is what God punished Israel for so many times, was their idolatry. But they still held on to some of the sacrifices and the like, because I think this is application for today. They felt like as long as they did certain things to appease God, then they could live and do whatever they wanted to do. They felt as long as they sacrificed to God and appeased him that way, gave him rams and goats and sacrificed rivers of oil, as long as they'd done those things, then they could worship these other gods too and live the way they wanted to live. That hit me as an application for today, because I see some Christians with the world view that, well, as long as I go to church on Sunday and I do some good things maybe during the week, then Monday through Saturday I can do what I want. Do you know people like that? I do. Shame on us. There's some legalistic thinking in the church of the people of God in the church, that as long as I do these good things, then it's okay if I fudge a little bit over here and over there. We've got the idea that as long as the good outweighs the bad, I'm okay. But is that biblical? It is not. So I think that was a real application as I studied this for today. He talks about 4 evildoers. In chapter 2, verse 1, he talks about the land grabbers. And these folks would lay awake at night scheming of how that I can get someone's house or get someone's land. This was forbidden in the Torah. They could not buy or even take land on a permanent basis. On the year of Jubilee, it went back to the family that owned it. They didn't like that rule. They did what they wanted, and they were evil in their ideas about grabbing land and grabbing possessions and houses, oppressing the poor. Secondly, in that group of evildoers were rulers who hated good and loved evil. That's in chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. Also, there were false prophets who divined for money. Hey, I'm a prophet. You pay me enough money, I'll tell you what you want to hear. You want me to tell you things are going to go good? Just slip me a little coin over here, and I'll tell you what you want to hear. There were priests who preached for money, and they would tell the people what they wanted to hear. There were, in chapter 3, verse 11, there were priests that would say, no evil will befall us. because we are the children of God. Because we're God's children, there's nothing bad going to happen to us. That's what they wanted to hear. That's what they paid their priest to say. We've already mentioned that the idolatry, that's in chapter 5, that he mostly talks about that, verses 12 through 15. Worshiping God and mixing the worship of idols with that. You shall have no other gods before me. And that has an application for today. Do we have idols today?
Anything can be our God.
Maybe we don't bow down to a piece of wood or a stone carving like they did in these days. It's possible that still happens, but it more applies to us in what Bruce just said. Anything that we put first before God can be an idol. That's a scary thought, because money could be an idol. Possessions can be an idol. Family can be an idol. If I put my family first before God, is that the proper place for me to put in family? Really, no. Now, I should care about my family. I should provide for my family. I should probably put my family second, but I should put my God first. Actually, it should all work together. My family and myself, that should be our goal, to please God first. Sports. Oh, did I step on some toes there? Because sometimes sports can be an idol, especially if sports gets in the way of what you should be doing for God. These are not bad things, but when we get the priorities wrong on these good things, they can become idols.
Politics.
Politics. Ooh. I wouldn't go in there, Bruce, but
Well, that's true.
any of these things. Let's put God first. What did Jesus say the greatest command was? Love God with all your mind, with all your spirit, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your being. Love God. What's the second command?
Out of that flows love.
Out of that flows love for our fellow man. Love your neighbor as yourself.
I used to have a conversation with the kids on we tend to want to break up our life into pieces of pie. Like, this belongs to God, this belongs to me, this belongs to my family, this belongs to God. Has the whole pie.
God belongs.
And it's how I manage those things. Is what
That's a really good thought and a good way to think about it. It's all God's domain. It's all God's property. All of those things we should use to glorify God. But it is out of our love for God that love flows to our fellow man. Okay. I think that pretty much covers the four evils that Micah talks about in all of his chapters of the books, of the chapters of the book. We kind of touched on this one in chapter 3, verse 11. They actually thought that since they were God's people, their security could not be destroyed, that God's favor could be bought with sacrifice. And then we know that's not true, but they actually fell into that trap and believed that and lived that way, and that's what brought judgment upon them. Okay, we've already said that Samaria was overthrown in 721. He predicts this in chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. Therefore, I will make Samaria a heap of rubble, a place for planting vineyards. I will pour her stones into the valley and lay bare her foundations. All her idols will be broken into pieces. Her temple's gifts will be burned with fire. I will destroy her images. Since she scattered her gifts from the wages of prostitutes, the wages of prostitutes will again be used. So he prophesies the fall of Samaria, and it actually comes about in his lifetime, 721 BC. Part of the problem with Jerusalem at the time was not only were they sinful, but they were not merciful. If you look at chapter 3, verses 1 through 4, they had not heard the cry for mercy, therefore God would not hear their cry for mercy. They hadn't been merciful, they would not be shown mercy. So this is the judgment part. He's pouring out the judgment on Israel, and then we're also going to look at the hope of Israel as well. Chapter 3, verse 6. They had not heeded the prophets, so there would be no guidance for them. Micah is the first prophet that specifically warned against the destruction of Jerusalem. This is in 3, verse 12. The wrong book, wrong chapter. Therefore, because of you, Zion will be plowed like a field. Jerusalem will become a heap of rubble. The temple hill will be overgrown with thickets. Other prophets prophesied this as well. We already mentioned that came about in about 586 BC when Jerusalem was destroyed and Judah was taken away into Babylonian captivity.
They're also cannibalistic in their sins. Said Micah says he also ate the flesh of his people and used their skin from off them. That's evil.
It's evil, and whether that was literal cannibalism or just they were so evil to each other, they were killing each other. They were violent with each other. Not only did they take advantage of the poor, were they not kind to each other, they actually robbed, stole, killed. They were evil. The punishment will fit the crime. They had taken the land from the poor, their land would be taken from them. That's in chapter 1, verse 16, also chapter 4, verse 10. They would be driven out as the Canaanites were driven out before them, chapter 2, verse 10. Okay, now let's spend a little bit of time in chapter 6. This is actually kind of a court scene with the hills of Palestine being the judges. God is the complainant, Israel is the defendant. And if you're looking at verses 1 through 8 here, it's not God's failure, it is Israel's disloyalty. So Israel is convicted in the court in verses 1 through 8. Israel complains that God's demands are unknowable. We just don't know how to please him. He wants numerous sacrifices of calves and rams. God wants rivers of oils or sacrifices of even of our first child. Who done that? Who sacrificed their child? Ahaz. Who was the kings during Micah's time? Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. We find out in 2 Kings 16:3, I believe it talks about Ahaz had his son pass through the fire, and it literally, he sacrificed a son to Molech. How despicable is that? But it happened, and that was a king of Judah that done that. So how evil had Israel become? Micah demands, and let's look at this together. This is 6 verse 7, 8, 9, 7, 8. Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams and 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I offer my firstborn of transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? Verse 8. He has shown you, O man, what is good. What does the Lord require of you? to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. So they were saying, we don't know how to please God. And Micah tells them, this is how you please God. Act justly. They weren't doing that. Love mercy. They weren't doing that. And walk humbly with your God. They weren't doing that. So, we've already talked about what the greatest command is. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength, being. The second commandment, love neighbors as yourself. Here, Micah says the duty of man is to act justly, love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. What does Solomon say at the end of Ecclesiastes?
Vanity, vanity.
This is the conclusion of the matter.
Fear God.
That's the difference.
Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Do you hear the echoes of the same things? The greatest command, the second command, what Micah is saying here. And there are other prophets that echo the same thing. And then what Solomon says. And remember what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. You hear these echoes. It's pretty simple. Love God and treat each other like God treats us. Let that love that God has for us overflow into the love that we have for each other. Treat each other kindly. They weren't doing that. And that's what caused judgment to come upon Israel. Okay. Any questions so far of what we've covered so far? And I know we're jumping around from different chapters and the like, but what I'm really trying to cover is the type of prophecies that Micah was making toward Israel and Judah. Comments? Must be doing a really good job. Good cat.
Fitting these into the book of Kings and Chronicles becomes interesting. When you're reading about the kings and how they were portrayed. Jotham was a fairly good king. Ahaz, his son, was wicked. Hezekiah will be a good king. After a period of time, apparently.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe influenced by the prophecies of and then just to realize that these guys are also contemporary with some of the others. That's a interesting thread.
Who were Micah's contemporary? Who else was prophesying at the same time as Micah?
Isaiah, for one.
Isaiah.
And Hosea might have been at the beginning, or at least he was a few years, maybe not contemporary as prophet, but
Jack Lewis puts Jonah also in this time period.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that Isaiah, Hosea, Jonah were contemporaries of Micah, and who else was Hosea in Judah around this same time. So these guys all lived about the same time, and they were all prophesying in different areas of the north and the south, and they were telling Israel what was going to happen. God is making a judgment on your disobedience, and you are going to be punished. But after judgment comes hope, and we're going to look at that too. In fact, that would be a good time to look at that. Let's look at the last chapter of Micah, chapter 7. And there are other glimmers of hope. It actually divides it. I think the book is divided into chapters 1 through 3 was the first section, 4 and 5 was the second section, and 6 and 7 were the last section. Each section begins with, "Hear ye," or "Listen to the word of the Lord," and they end with a glimmer of hope about how strong God's love is and how he's going to be forgiving and he's going to fulfill his promises to Israel. Now let's look together at the end of the book, chapter 7, verses 18 through the end of the chapter. Who is a God like you, who pardons sin and forgives transgression, the remnant of his inheritance, who do not stay angry? You do not stay angry forever. You delight to show mercy. You again will have compassion on us. You will tread our sins underfoot and hurl all of our iniquities into the depths of the sea. You will be true to Jacob, and you will show mercy to Abraham, as you pledged an oath to our fathers in days long ago. There's your hope. First must come judgment, and hope always follows judgment. In each of these minor prophet books, you'll see the same pattern over and over again. In the other Old Testament books, you'll see the same pattern over and over again. God must punish evil. And once he does, then his covenant love and promises are fulfilled, and God's always more powerful than human disobedience. So if we look at it that way, hope always follows judgment. God must judge and confront evil among his people. This is always through the Old Testament and continues today, I believe. He always confronts evil among his people. And after that comes hope. He fulfills his covenant promise. Any comments there?
Another way to look at that is the consequences of rebellion. What we call judgment. It's designed to bring men back to us. When we think of punishment, it's designed to have people return.
It's always with the idea of restoration, bringing them back to God. So anytime God pronounced judgment on his people, it was always with the goal in mind to bring them back and to restore them back in a right relationship with him. What Mike just said about how we think about punishment, whether it be bringing up our children or whether it's the justice system today, godly judgment always has restoration in mind. We don't always think about that. We don't think about punishment that way. We think it's punishment as a bad thing. But punishment can turn a child around and bring them back into a little obedience. You got to teach them a little obedience every now and then. Child Protective Services reads this, I know, you're in trouble. But that's what it's designed to do. And the other part, Mike, as you were saying that, we can really do some goofed up stuff in our lives. We can really goof up our lives. Can we do anything that we can't be forgiven of? As long as you got breath in your body and you can repent, there's always forgiveness. But what about consequences? When you were saying that, Mike, we can mess our lives up to the point that, yeah, God can forgive us. We can still have a home in heaven. But we're going to have to suffer some of those consequences in this life because of the choices that we make. If that's not an application for today and in the church today, I don't know what is. But think about those things. Just because someone is dealing with the consequence of their sin doesn't mean that they have not moved past that and have not received the forgiveness that's available for someone who truly repents. Okay, we got it like,
Bible says the blasphemy of the Holy Spirit. But what is that? That's where you deny Jesus. And that's the only way you can be permanently not forgiven. Because as long as you're walking in the light, you have fellowship, and the blood of Jesus continue to cleanse us. But blasphemy of the Spirit means, to me, that we just completely walk away from Jesus and leave him out of our lives.
if we deny our only hope, and Jesus is our only hope, if we deny that, then we are turning our back. We're turning our back on God, and
you're saying no to the Spirit.
There is no point of return. And at some point in our lives, when we've gotten so rebellious that we can't hear God's call and can't come back, then I think that's what you're talking about, yes. Verse 2. Yes. Okay, a couple of questions that were in the back of the Jack Lewis book that I thought were significant. What was the motives for a man to be a false prophet? What sorts of motives were these guys that were being false prophets and telling the people what they wanted to hear? What was the motive for that? Money. What else?
Financial gains.
Money. Prestige. Popularity. You know, that was the motivation for these guys to tell them what they wanted to hear. I'll take a bribe. I'll give you a prophecy that you want. I'll make a prediction. I'll tell fortunes for money. Now, the prophets weren't fortune tellers, but many of their prophecies did come true. But they weren't fortune tellers. They were just telling a word of God's judgment that was going to come true. In that sense, they were not fortune tellers.
They weren't inspired by God as God's people were.
That was the difference.
And of course, God knows that. We have to identify what's truth and what isn't.
That's right. Test the spirits, as James says. Other than man's duty, we kind of covered this already. Other than man's duty in 6:8, where it says, "Love, act justly, love mercy, walk humbly with your God." What did Ecclesiastes say? Fear God and keep his commandments. This is the whole duty of man. What did Jesus say was the greatest command and the second command? Love God. Love your neighbor as yourself. All those things kind of echo together, not just in those three places, but those were the three places that jumped out to me as I was studying for this. Were Micah's warnings brought to fulfillment?
Yes,
the destruction of Jerusalem in 586, the destruction and the captivity of Samaria in 721 BC.
Babylonian captivity after that.
And possibly this was something I read too. I think there's an allusion in chapter 5 about the return to Jerusalem after the captivity, after the Babylonian captivity. That possibly was a prophecy as well. How is Micah's moral religious preaching relevant to us today?
What you said about coming to church on Sunday, but leaving how you want the rest of the week.
They had it wrong about, as long as I do these things to appease God, then I can do what I want the other 4 or 5, 6 days of the week. As long as I give God a piece of my life on Sunday, or do this good thing on Tuesday or Thursday, then the rest of the week's mine. I can do what I want to do. That's what they had. That's the way they lived, and that's what the judgment came upon them about. So, very good. That was one of the learnings that I wanted to make sure that we grabbed a hold of. We talked about idolatry. Now, we could have idols today, whether you're not necessarily bound down to a piece of wood or a stone carved, but we can have anything that takes the place of the first position that God should have can become an idol, and we always have to be on guard about that. Why do you think each section included a message of hope?
So there's a point where your message of judgment beats a person down to the point that they can't hear it anymore.
To give up. What's the use?
Yeah.
But it always brings it back to a loving God. He loves us enough to discipline us. He loves us enough to confront the evil among us, to bring us back to restoration, into a right relationship with Him. Hope always follows judgment. That's true in the Minor Prophets. That's true in the other Old Testament books. It's true in the New Testament. It's true because it's the character of God. Any other comments? There's a lot in Micah. If we were to try to go through it verse by verse, it would take several weeks of study, I think, to do that. And that really wasn't what we intended to do when we decided to study the Minor Prophets. Just give you an overview of that. If there's something that really piques your curiosity, dig into it a little bit more at home. Find out what these high places, what does that talk about? What is that? What's all that about? Find out how these prophecies actually did come true and some of the dates that they did happen. It's interesting to follow that history, but it's also interesting to know that God is true to His word. If He says it's going to happen, take that to the bank, it's going to happen. And then again, it all ends with God is a loving God. And the point of all of this is to bring us back into a right relationship with Him. To the restoration is always the goal. Okay, that's all I have. Thank you very much. We'll